issues. So I've been meaning to stream in the morning just to see if more people are paying attention in the mornings or not. But I listened to Paul Vanderklay's video, which is linked in the description, and I just thought it was kind of the type of important discussion that we haven't been having enough of, going back to those things which are most fundamental. And during the synod, it came out to salvation issues, right? And we keep on going back to Sam the heretic. If anybody wants to join, please do, because I would rather have this as a conversation. This isn't something that I've really thought through enough to do a presentation really on. But so this idea of a salvation issue. So here, I'll just play the beginning of this question I asked Cedric Parcells. I'm going to use host's prerogative to put the Reverend Parcells to bed, because he does need to get up in the morning.
Sorry, Reverend. Thank you.
But before he goes, I have a question. Let's say, God forbid, that I were to burn somebody at the stake for not being a Trinitarian, and I did not repent of that. Is that a salvation issue? Lloyd, please jump on. I would love if you would jump on to discuss this salvation issue, right? I want. So what Vanderklay was talking about this morning, which is what Jordan Peterson is talking about, is who are your heroes, who are your saints, and who are the sinners, right? And if 500 years after 2,000 years after Pilate and Jesus, you can't look back and see that Pilate is the villain and Jesus is the hero. And then 500 years after Calvin and Servetus, you can't look back and see that Servetus is the hero and Calvin is the villain. There's a reason I keep on saying the holy martyr Michael Servetus, may God avenge his blood. There's still a university called Calvin University. And that university, that has it upside down. And this is a salvation issue. It really is a salvation issue. It's a question of who is that hero you look towards. Hello, everyone. There are lots of people watching. And any of them who wants to join, you're very welcome. Look at the life of Michael Servetus, the holy man, Michael Servetus, and look at the life of John Calvin. John Calvin was one of the most successful murderers in human history. Dozens, some over 50 people were murdered at his command for heresy. And it like, is this the fruit of the Spirit? Is it? is this what being? So I was looking at the last words of Michael Servetus. He was given the opportunity to repent of his denial of the Trinity, and he would not have been burnt at the stake. And his last words were, Jesus, Son of the eternal God, have mercy on me. Contrast that with John Calvin. There's various accounts of how he, of his last days. But yes, justice for Servetus. But he died in the confidence. His presumed confidence that his presumed confidence that he was saved. And how do you look back at that life and not realize that he was, if the ideas that most Calvinists have, 5-point Calvinists have, of total depravity, unconditional election, I guess it is, limited atonement, irresistible grace, and perseverance of the saints. And the idea that a true faith in God manifests itself in the works of the Spirit, right? Then how do you walk that walk and not realize that John Calvin was not part of the elect, that Jesus did not die for John Calvin. John Calvin was not a Christian. John Calvin is burning in hell according to the understanding of John Calvin. I mean, so Paul Vanderklay was like, yeah, don't burn my Sam. And I'm glad that Calvinists no longer are burning Unitarians at the stake. And my comment was, yeah, I'm glad that Calvinists are no longer burning Unitarians at the stake. But can we talk about what caused them to burn Unitarians at the stake? Was that not a failure of the gospel to reach them? Chris says, okay, I missed that leap somehow. I don't know what leap I am not making clear. John Calvin was a murderer. John Calvin was someone who murdered some 50 people, including Michael Servetus, who lived an exemplary life. Michael Servetus, I mean, look at the life of Michael Servetus. He lived a life of devotion, of kindness, of charity, of believing in one God. And if there was the death penalty for heresy, still some might take theology a little more seriously. I don't think the death penalty for heresy ever did any good. This is and thousands of years after Christianity, if a Christian can't read their gospel and see that killing people for their heresy doesn't work, I don't know which gospel you're reading. I really don't know. Why Calvin is burning in hell? I think it was the state that it. No, it was John Calvin was very clearly behind the murder of Michael Servetus. There's, I mean, this is just like people are deliberately trying to avoid what we know very clearly, which is what John Calvin was behind the murder of Servetus. He wrote letters about it to Luther, and Luther back. There's no question here that that John Calvin had a hatred in his heart for Michael Servetus. That's not even it's not a real question. Many historians have explained how Calvin was essentially set up to be blamed for it. Yeah, this is Calvinist apologetics. It's honestly just dishonest. It really is. When you look into it, when you see what was happening, and I have looked into it. There are all kinds of ways in which people who the rest is history. Did they do Servetus? I don't remember if they did Servetus. I mean, I have listened to everything I have been able to get my hands on in terms of Servetus and Calvin. I have heard no even plausible deniability of. I mean, the letters that that Calvin wrote both before and after the murder of Servetus are all there, right? And the sentiment that I mean, Calvin's sentiments are just so obvious. He was sure 100% that he was right about everything. Yeah, it was an episode within the last year. Yeah, I mean, what exactly are you claiming? That Calvin was set up? Well, I have heard this, which is that Servetus knew that if Calvin were to kill him, it would make him look bad, which is true, 100%. I think that Servetus very clearly was living a life modeled around both the Gospels and around the life of Paul of Tarsus as it was described in the book of Acts. And he viewed himself going to Geneva in a very similar way as Jesus going to Jerusalem and Paul going to Jerusalem to meet up with his accusers. It was an act of picking up his cross and a willing martyrdom for Christianity. I mean, I don't see how Christians don't view that, don't see that, right? And the setup is the wrong word, but Servetus essentially forced it. Yes, exactly. He forced the issue. Just like Jesus did, just like Paul did. He was a Christian. Servetus was a Christian. And I don't understand how, as a Christian who has that model from the book of Acts and the Gospels in their imaginary, right? This is my symbolic universe. How you don't see that that Servetus was acting precisely as Jesus and as Paul did, And Calvin was precisely Pilate in this story. He was clearly acting as Pilate. Chris, if you can, jump on. However, I essentially agree with you on defending Servetus, but I guess I have a little more grace for Calvin. What grace can you have for Pilate? What grace can you have for Pilate? Jacob, your stated goal is to influence current politics and not get into internal Christian affairs. How does this discussion fit in? Okay, so my stated goal in my engagement outside of Judaism with Christianity is political, correct? Ultimately, though, I think you have to lead with your values, and as long as the narrative places, as long as you have a narrative that places the saints as sinners and sinners as saints, right? You're topsy-turvy. You are topsy-turvy. And I mean, there's a reason why I'm talking about Acts in the Gospels, right? I could be arguing Unitarianism from a Jewish, like Deuteronomy 6:4 point of view and hammering on Mark 12, but that's not what I'm doing here, right? Yeah, so I hope that clarifies it. I have grace for Pope Leo and the Catholic hierarchy. When is Servetus getting on the stream? When the resurrection happens. I can see an analogy for you. The Jews in Jerusalem weren't responsible for Jesus' death by their own claim, so they blamed the Roman authorities, though it would not have happened without the Jewish mob. I mean, that gets into a whole other thing. But, I mean, as a Christian, can you not view someone who was calling for Jesus to be crucified? Can you call that person completely blameless? Like, again, where is your saints and sinners? Who are your saints? Who are your sinners? Right? And if Calvin isn't your sinner, what's going on? Right? Like, call Calvin the Jewish mob in Jerusalem, call Calvin Pilate, call Calvin the Sanhedrin, call Calvin the Roman guards, call Calvin whoever you want. Who's your Jesus in this story? And if it's not clear who the Jesus in this story is, which I think, I mean, it's pretty clear to me who Jesus in that story is, right? You don't name your universities after John Calvin. You name them after Michael Servetus. That's the point. Eventually, I think the CRC is going to have to come to grips with the fact that their university is called Calvin University. And that's wrong. It's the wrong person to name your university after. Is it okay to revere martyrs if martyrdom is not something that is supposed to scale up? If a person is an actual martyr, I think it is definitely right to revere martyrs. The thing with martyrs is there has to be a a choice of life for the martyrs. Martyrs who choose to die are not martyrs. Martyrs have to decide to live in a real sense. Yeah. Okay. I think I've said everything I'm going to say. Hello, Sandy. Do you repent of being a Calvinist?
Interesting question.
Your sound is really bad, Sandy.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm gonna put my camera off. It's driving.
No, it's your microphone.
Oh, really? Probably pretty strong.
It's a lot better when the microphone's closer to your mouth.
Then I will put the video off and just. Okay.
Are you driving?
Yeah.
Sandy?
I'm looking for something. I just got to take it off.
A, I can barely hear you. B, you're driving.
Okay. I'll come back.
Talk to you later. Is Calvin University even Calvinist anymore? I think so, as far as I understand it. Okay, well, if nobody else is going to jump on, I am going to end this stream. I'll give it a couple more minutes. There's plenty of people watching. Okay, if Sam Adams is going to jump on to talk about the holy martyr, the Chezi is jumping on to speak about the holy martyr Michael Servetus. Hashem Dama.
I don't know how. I don't know. First of all, I just didn't want to see you hanging out alone, so I wanted to say hi.
Hello.
Second of all, here's
bad
Sam.
signal
Sam,
received.
you could take the floor, but I do want to say that first off, I owe you a conversation, Sam. I know I still need to get back to that. And secondly, well, Jacob just mentioned it, but what did you think about that comment? And we all know here that obviously Paul means it with love. But when he talks about, like, I don't want Sam to be burnt, and I don't want, that to happen. Is that like, does that sound cutesy? Does that sound like, I know it's sincere, but is that annoying to hear almost? Him say that, like, be nice to Sam? Or is that like, no, that's what I want to hear from the pastors. If everyone had Paul's attitude, I would be in a great place.
There is something a little bit. Am I coming out of this microphone? Test. All right, good. There is something a little bit. I mean, I like both appreciate it, but then there's part of me that's a little bit like,
It's not truly repentant, and that's why I did this thing. It's not truly repentant of what was done to Servetus.
Well, and I also feel like part of the reason why the Unitarians don't need to worry about being burnt anymore is because we built the United States. And welcome to our country with this Constitution that we wrote that doesn't allow you to burn us. Like, the Unitarians had to win to not let anyone be burnt anymore. So, like, it's there's a little bit of the you're welcome, like I feel like, the Rock in Moana, what can I say except you're welcome? We built the country where you're not allowed to burn us anymore.
Well,
And I hope you're enjoying yourself.
It's almost more than that. It's now that you're no longer a threat, I could accommodate you.
Yeah.
And I guess so. On the flip side, though, what could Paul say? Like,
Yeah.
what is it possible? Like, what more? How much more can he say?
He can say that burning Trinitarians at the stake was a mortal sin, which was exemplary of someone who was not truly saved. That's why I named this salvation issues, right? Because ultimately, the Calvinists have to be able to say, does election actually apply to John Calvin? And I think you have to say, this is not a saint. This is not somebody we claim as a saint in our tradition.
Yeah. I've been reading Servetus recently. My goal for 2015 is to do a series on him. I don't know how many episodes it would be. It might even be something.
2025, or you're 10 years late. You said
What?
2015.
Oh, did I say 2015? 2025. Yes, excuse me. My goodness, yeah. So next year to do like the way that I've done Church Fathers series in the past is to do a Servetus series. And
I would love to do it with you.
Hank might not get to be in all of them, or we'll see anyway. And I might throw in some guests from time to time, and I'd be honored to have you, Jacob. But I mean, like I what I said in that Christian Baxter interview that Paul was referencing is that the Overton window needs to be open so that Christological issues can once again be discussed in good faith. Hi, Chad. Sorry, I didn't pick up the phone. So that
I just realized.
so that this can once again be a topic that Christianity can discuss without fear of XYZ. And obviously now the fear isn't being burnt. Not because the Calvinists finally decided of their own accord that it was a good idea, but because the Calvinists converted to Unitarianism right around the time we were writing the Constitution. But I don't know where I'm going. But the more I read about Calvin and Servetus, like as guilty as you might think Calvin is of burning Servetus, he's 10 times more.
Mm-hmm.
It is way worse
Yep.
than the people in it's hard for us to imagine the injustice that Calvin committed against Servetus. He jailed him in a dungeon in Geneva without trial for almost like a year or something like that. Servetus appealed for more clothes and food. Calvin didn't grant it. He would yank Servetus randomly, unannounced, out of the dungeon to put him on the next phase of the trial. And it was basically a theological battle between Calvin and Servetus. Servetus, of course, has no access to a library or correspondence or anything during this time. He has no idea when the next time he's going to get to talk is. Calvin is sleeping in a comfortable bed. Servetus is literally in the dungeon, like underneath him.
You're pointing out the accusations of things like sexual immorality, which were proven to be untrue because Michael Servetus was physically incapable. Like they threw the kitchen sink at this guy.
Well, of course. I mean, when you're committing injustice against someone, you do everything in your power to try and make yourself look like the good guy and that he deserves it. And you throw every charge against him, even if they aren't the charges that you like. The level of injustice in this trial is awful. And Calvin bragged about it afterwards. Some people will be like, oh, it's just the City Council of Geneva, yada, yada, yada. Like Calvin himself took credit for it afterwards and was proud of it. And anyone who said that he didn't deserve credit, he felt insulted when people didn't give him credit for it. Because he's like, I would do it again. I did the right thing and I would do it again. Like it is more unjust than we are almost capable of imagining in our day and age.
Well, people don't want to look at that. They don't want to admit John Calvin was obviously wrong because he is one of their saints.
Yeah.
Okay, so but that's the rub, and I Sam, maybe you can answer this. Has there ever been like a correction like that with regards to saints, where it's someone like, I know like Jean d'Arc eventually became a saint, but I'm saying, is there an example in Christianity where like sainthood gets revoked because we found out XYZ?
That's a good question. And again, because it's also complicated, because Protestantism doesn't technically have saints. Well, like Calvin is treated like a de facto saint by many Calvinist traditions, but they don't have any formal paperwork on the issue or something like that. It's not like the Catholic Church where there's official process of becoming a saint. I'm sure someone who might know more about Catholicism than I do could give an example, probably of sainthood having been revoked post hoc. I bet that has happened, and I bet they might have a procedure for it. But of course, the Catholic Church doesn't think Calvin is a saint, so so what are you going to do for them? I think that I don't know what exactly. I mean, maybe Jacob is right. What needs to happen is that Calvin College in Grand Rapids needs to be named Servetus University. Maybe that's like the level that we're talking about.
When I drove Paul to Calvin University, it's the only time I was there. I told him, one day I hope that this university will be named Servetus University, and that is the type of change that I hope to see.
Right, but to defend Paul for a moment, when he comes and says, right, like, don't touch my Sam, my sweet little baby boy Sam, don't touch him. Instead, I want Sam because in my consciousness congress, and he teaches me, and he's here to learn. So in a certain way, that's an admission of, I have what to learn and I have what to tweak and to correct myself. Now, I don't think Paul or others could come out and say like, well, I guess we were wrong, and now we'll flip it on its head. I guess the way it has to evolve is exactly like that. Like, I'm using this as an example with regard to the Noahides. A very depressing comment I saw with regards to one of the Noahides after he saw some video or interview that he didn't like, and he said, I thought up until now we were in the stage of the Israelites in the desert. I'm saying we're at that stage as far as Noahides, but in reality, after seeing this video, I realized that we're still in Egypt. And that was very hard for me to think of, like, a group sort of recognizing that and seeing their place. Now, it's hard to see yourself as a Unitarian, like, quote unquote, still in the Exodus or still in Egypt. However, I don't know, when Paul says what he says, we could look at that as like, that's not really what I want to hear. On the other hand, we have to realize in a certain sense, that's an invitation from Paul to say, like, I want you to keep talking. I want you to keep challenging me, because if it's not me, if it's my son, if it's not my son, it's the people hearing this, and I'm open to that for them hearing these new ideas. So
here's a proposal
Here's
a proposal for the next step that the CRC could take prior, perhaps, to renaming their flagship university. All right, the Athanasian Creed needs to be struck down from the list of official creeds endorsed by the CRC. First of all, it's not written by Athanasius. It's a forgery written at least 100 years, more like 200 or 300 years after Athanasius died, in a language that Athanasius couldn't even write in. And so it's pretending to be Athanasian, even though it's not. An individual can't write a creed. A church council writes a creed. The reason why they attributed it to Athanasius is to try and sneak it in prior to the rule that said that individuals can't write creeds anymore. Only church councils can write creeds. Oh, and by the way, we're done writing creeds. This is the last one. No more. Right? So they tried to sneak in a creed that was written way after that to make it look earlier than that. The Eastern Orthodox Church is like, what's this Athanasian Creed? This is baloney. This is written in Latin. Athanasius, we know that this Athanasian Creed, we know not. The Oriental Church, the Egyptian Church, who loves Athanasius above anybody, is like, what the heck is this, guys? We're not right. This is not the Athanasius we know and love. But anyway, the particular points of the Athanasian Creed. Yeah, I'm on the CRC website too. All right, first sentence. Whoever desires to be saved should above all hold to the Catholic faith. Anyone who does not keep it whole and unbroken will doubtless perish eternally. Now, this is the Catholic faith. We worship God in Trinity and unity, blah, 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 Trinitarian babble nonsense for a while. All right. Anyone who then desires to be saved should thus think about the Trinity. But it is necessary for eternal salvation that one who believes in the, yada, 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 incarnational stuff. This is the Catholic faith. One cannot be saved without believing it firmly and faithfully. This creed condemns me to hell in no uncertain terms whatsoever. And it condemns any non-Trinitarian. And even then, it's almost like a Latin Western Trinitarian. One could even say that it condemns Eastern Orthodox flavors of Trinitarianism to hell, too. And so this document is...
Does it mention the procession from...
I believe so. Yeah. I believe it is fully filioquated somewhere in there. I'd have to search or look for that to figure out where that is. But it's somewhere in there. And it's rather long and nonsensical, honestly. And like I said, not by Athanasius. It's a forgery. And it is not officially endorsed by any church council. It pretended to be so. The Catholic Church got fooled by this forgery, and Protestantism, for whatever reason, carries on this Catholic forgery that fooled the Catholic Church and still endorses it for reasons that are just utterly beyond my comprehension. Anyway.
Double procession. The Holy Spirit was neither made nor created nor begotten. He proceeds from the Father and the Son. So yeah.
So even like a Eastern Orthodox theologian like Photius of, I think he was of Constantinople, one of the greatest theologians in Eastern Orthodox history from like, say, the 9th or 10th century, something like that, who firmly rejected the filioque and said the Holy Spirit proceeds directly from the Father, not through the Son. He would be condemned to eternal damnation by, this creed. So this is one of those things. When I say crowbar open the Overton window, it is this creed and the fact that a lot of Protestants are familiar with it, read it, have it on their various church denominational websites, maybe even have to recite it in church every once in a while. This is the sort of thing that I'm talking about. And like I said, even if you agree with the theology, you could at least condemn it on procedural grounds. It's literally a forgery. So anyway, that's my gentle proposal. Paul Vanderklay, if you want a concrete next step, grave him in the Athanasian Creed out of the CRC. Boom. There's a concrete request.
You could put in a confessional revision gravamen.
Oh no! Wouldn't I have to be a member or something? Don't I at least have to be a member of a CRC church to do something like that?
No. I think a confessional difficulty gravamen, you have to be an officer or an office bearer. I think a confessional revision gravamen anybody can submit.
Interesting.
It sounds like the Canadian college of psychologists thing that happened to Peterson, that anybody can make a complaint. This is weird. You guys, we kind of sound like weird Loki's. Like they should go full evergreen on Calvin College and change it to Servetus. Dude, that'd be awesome, wouldn't it?
Sam, do you think, all jokes aside, do you think Paul could survive?
I wasn't joking.
Could Paul survive something like that?
Like, how would you imagine that unfolding? Paul's like, you know what? I'm done with this. I agree with you, Sam. This is nonsense. I'm petitioning this.
Like, here's one thing that is interesting. Paul could say, Nicene Creed, fine. I'm still a Trinitarian. And we should still be confessionally Trinitarian, but I don't know that my non-Trinitarian Christian friends are damned to hell with the level of certainty that this creed seems to purport. And so that's exactly, so that this is like the level. I'm not asking the CRC to become non-Trinitarian. I'm asking it to not be certain that non-Trinitarians are damned, because obviously that would include Jews as well, obviously, and Muslims of every flavor, like so Jehovah's Witnesses, Mormons, Oneness, Pentecostals, all sent straight to hell with absolute certainty in this creed. And like I said, even the Eastern Orthodox are damned by this one, technically, kind of. Some Eastern Orthodox might be able to do an Athanasian dance on this one, but mostly they would be damned to hell too.
Phlebas says we specifically don't condemn people to hell or declare them to heaven. That is Catholics and Orthodox. The door is open for Calvin to be in hell, just as we all could. Yeah, but you don't name your university after people you think are burning in
right
hell.
Well, and it says one cannot be saved without believing it firmly and faithfully. That's the last line of the creed. I mean, Phlebas, you can push back on that all you want. That's the last line. I'm not making this up. So
anyways, good to see you guys. I'm out of here.
all right.
I have nothing to offer.
Chris,
Yes.
what are your thoughts?
Yeah, Sam, you had me thinking, and I've heard you explain this many times, that every lay person you'd come across, if you ask them to explain the Trinity, they're going to explain it in a way that has been declared a heresy one way or another. And I'm not even sure that if you ask me to do it right now, so if I'm holding it faithfully, and what was the other word you used?
Faithfully and firmly.
Yeah, and firmly. It's like, I don't want to, if I hold it too firmly and then you ask me to say it, then I'm going to damn myself to hell, because I'm likely going to spit out one of the, dozen ways I've heard someone explain it. It's like, oh, I filed the wrong one.
Right. And it also needs to be whole and unbroken. And like all of these words are used in here, necessary. So all of those, that whole package, necessary, whole, firm, unbroken, faithfully, etc. These are all words in that creed.
Yeah, it almost seems like it's such a trap. So, it's funny for me to be in the position in the chat where it seemed like I was the guy defending Calvin, because in my everyday life with so many of my Christian friends, like one of my close buddies I work with, he's big time Calvinist, and I'm just always ragging on him. And it's also ironic that I daily listen to a Calvinist pastor and don't consider myself Calvinist and have many of these critiques that Jacob had. I guess, I used to think of Calvin as like, Lenin was in Geneva 300 years before Lenin was actually there. Like, I always thought about Calvin in Geneva as almost doing, I think it was Chad, almost did an evergreen type takeover of the city, of this idea of like a complete moral regeneration. And I know we all think about Calvin as, especially after the fact, as just rigidly doctrinaire. He was, and I know he gave himself these reasons, he's challenging theologically, but so much of it seemed like there's a huge moral valence to their theological squabbles. And it's just like, I see some, I guess, leftism in Calvin, which is wild for my Calvinist friends to kind of wrap their head around. It's like, you don't realize he's doing like a whole.
There were good parts of his transformation of Geneva too.
Sure.
And
yeah.
I wouldn't, I think that Geneva in 1540, 1550 would have been a very interesting and dynamic place, but it had this weird mix of sort of utopian revolutionaryism combined with this kind of hyper-zealousness that was a very combustible thing. I mean, I don't like it really eventually it mellowed out. It was at such a fever pitch that it couldn't maintain that for very long. But one of the very interesting things that happened at Geneva is that previously Christians had said that they couldn't loan at interest because that was usury. And so they let the Jews loan at interest. So there's this weird thing where the Christians were maintaining a certain interpretation of an Old Testament law that the Jews weren't maintaining. And so that was a kind of an upside down situation in and of itself. And Calvin was one of the first Christians to say, actually, you can loan at interest, that especially business to business or for commercial reasons. This is more about just not taking advantage of someone and throwing them in debtor's prison or something like that. And that was like an explosion of European capitalism that would end up transforming Western Europe dramatically. And so it's not like,
and why we have Swiss banks today.
And why we have Swiss banks today. Yeah. So there's this whole complicated situation. It's not like Calvin's Geneva was all bad. There was this very amazing thing, and it was probably a more just place to live than lots of other parts of Europe, even if they were burning Unitarians.
Yeah, I'd be very curious to really set myself, there's got to be somebody who's written Geneva in that time period, and how much they're overlapping with that radical Reformation that's happening elsewhere, that's been burning for a couple decades by that point. I know you had the weird Scottish and Swiss connection, with Scottish troops coming to these Swiss Confederated States that no one's willing to go climb up the mountains to try to fight too hard, and there's a weird loop there with what you described as like the development of I guess like the rights of the accused in like a Western liberal society, almost as kind of this libertarian civil rights development that came out of the injustice done to Servetus. But then you have Calvin's commitment, or Calvin's kind of opening the percentage of usury. I remember reading about from like Murray Rothbard back in college, talking about, Calvin is one of the great theologians who helped spark capitalism. You have obviously the Max Weber thesis right there too. So yeah, there's something about just that ferment in Geneva in that time it's like still somewhat mirroring all of our little corners of political value and religious value. We're still here. We are still trying to chew on it,
The joke I make is I try to kill two people every day, Martin Luther and John Calvin. But one thing that I also try to make clear is that doesn't mean that I want to go back to a world where they did not exist, right? And this really, for me, goes back to, in the sayings of the fathers, the Mishnah Avot says, Ohev et habriot, you should love creatures, right? God's creatures. And that includes those things that their only redeeming quality is the fact that they were created. Because obviously the fact that something was created means that God had a use for that person, right? And I would say the same thing about Satan, right? God had a use for the serpent and Satan and Martin Luther and John Calvin. And so I would not go back in time and kill Hitler or kill Calvin or kill the serpent in the garden. At the same time, that doesn't mean that I can't say that we can't valorize this. We can't, like John Calvin and Martin Luther contributed to history. Great. Let us bury them and move forward.
So what I heard from Sam and Chris, and I'm not hearing directly from you, but I hear what you're saying. I was going to ask about steel manning Calvin, and you're mentioning your point right now, and this to me connects to, there's a political conversation, right, with like, should we change the names of certain schools, right, in America because of what they represent? And the answer is like no, because even if we now know that this person was a racist or we had issues with his ideology, we're going to use it as an educational moment, right? We know we're going to learn into this. So I go back to changing the name of the school, for example. Is that really necessary? Or is it more about like, no, we should just shine a light on who he was, recognize the relevant things, but not shy away from the truth? And by doing so, is it, Jacob, to you, if you're going to tell someone like, the two people I want to kill, or they should change the name of the school, it's going to be very hard for people to accept. But
okay, so if the question was, do we change it from Calvin University to Grand Rapids University, I would say no. But if you're changing it from Calvin University to Servetus University, that's different.
It's a tikkun.
It is a redemption.
What's
right?
What's that word mean that Hezi just said?
Tikkun literally means rectification. It's you're turning things right up again, right? And so like this is the difference between me and Father Eric regarding the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. I think it needs to be moved into a museum, and he says no, just destroy it, right? Because ultimately that Michelangelo painting, it is something that has caused incredible evil in the world, right? This depiction of God the Father, right, it's just plain wrong. But I think you put it in a museum and say this was a mistake, as opposed to destroy.
And it's also kind of well done. It's pretty too. Yeah. Michelangelo wasn't a slouch, so yeah. I'll leave that up to the Catholics, what they think they should do with that. I mean, I've been to the Sistine Chapel, surprisingly small. You think it's going to be enormous. It's actually, it's somewhat cramped, and it's actually a little bit hard to see the pictures. They aren't as big as you think they would be. Anyway.
Okay, so I guess renaming it Servetus University, that's burning the chapel.
Well, I've been, when I was getting into Servetus, I thought I was going to find someone who had sort of like kind of early undeveloped Unitarian ideas. And I was going to be like, okay, those are cute. Those arguments are cute, but we know a lot more now than we used to. And the beginning of a thing is, not as impressive as later things sometimes. And that here are some interesting, cute things that Servetus thought. But whatever, let's move on. But I didn't realize, I think he was probably the most profound reformational theologian of his time. And I honestly did not expect that. And I'm not just saying that to pat myself on the back. He's almost not even Unitarian. His Christology is so weird that I almost don't know quite how to categorize it. But his theology, he loved the church fathers. And like, honestly, what he seems to be trying to do is he's like trying to make Christianity Philo of Alexandria again. He's like, we need to reboot back to Philo of Alexandria, take some of those ideas, not go off on the wrong track the way some people did. And here is this like reconstruction that's super Neoplatonic, but also has this kind of weird new Renaissance energy to it and late medieval stuff and proto-scientific stuff in it. And it's like this absolutely bizarre, but amazingly brilliant and intellectually sophisticated, full-blown theology that he had just been sitting on and not been able to tell anybody about, and wrote it in this book, and then was sharing some early copies with Calvin and got in trouble. And that eventually got him killed. And here's one of the greatest ironies. I just love this detail. Oh, he published like 500 copies of his book. Like something like 498 of them got burnt. 2 of them survived. 1 of them didn't even survive in total. The only full complete copy of Michael Servetus's work that we have was the one that Calvin kept in his own library in case he ever needed to prove that Servetus was a heretic post facto. So the only reason we have the book is because we have Calvin's copy. It's like, what? This is so weird that I don't even know what to make of it. Like, there's something so strangely poetically upside down about that.
Yeah, did Calvin recognize his brilliance? Was he?
I said you could even say it's divine providence.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, it's like, did Calvin recognize
No,
the brilliance
Calvin
of
routinely.
Servetus?
We have the notes from the trial. Calvin routinely fails to understand what Servetus is saying. Repeatedly fails to understand Servetus's point. It is like one giant Kathy Newman interview. It's so weird. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. He's like a so what you're saying is kind of guy.
Yeah.
So what you're saying is that the gospel never penetrated into Calvin's heart.
No.
I guess, okay, this is where, you know, I wanted to show grace for Calvin, even though, Jacob, I everything you were saying about his guilt and the injustice done to Servetus, I'm like, yes, I agree. And I'm thinking back, you know, when I was saying to Sam about, you know, an inability to firmly and faithfully recite the Trinity in a proper way, damns me to hell. I'm kind of like, you know, I can see Calvin's sins because, you know, it helps me minimize mine, I guess. So it's like, if I want to hold Calvin to this really strict, rock solid, you know, what he held people to, it's like I'm going to hang myself on my own petard, I guess, like basically stringing up my own cross. If I want to say Calvin's in hell, then I'm going to find out, because maybe I'm going to go there too.
That is the important part. It's by his standards. He's the one. Like I in my judgment, Calvin, like I'm not gonna. I have zero investment in Calvin being in hell. It is his judgment which I am applying to him, which I think is fair.
A wise man once said, the measure that you use against others will be used against you. I'm struggling to remember who said that at the moment.
Well, funny enough, I used to never quote that with Christians because it comes from the Talmud. And then I saw it in the Christian Bible.
Chris.
Yeah.
You don't have to answer this if you don't want. But what would you need to hear? Because, you know, you're hearing Sam right now, you're hearing Jacob. You're like, I agree with you, but you're dealing with this tension. Who is the authority that you would need to hear to make you be like, you know what? I guess Sam's right.
I don't know. I kind of do think Sam's right.
Oh, well, that was easy. But okay, so sure.
That makes one of us.
How now? I'm assuming you're a church-going person.
Yes.
Okay, so you and the family, your dad, like, what would that look like? That kind of conversation, like, what would they need to hear for them to change their mind? Like, who is the authority?
I feel like there's a part of the question I'm missing context for.
Well, I guess the challenge is going back to Paul. You know, Paul comes and says, you know what, Sam, you're right. And I'm going to go and I'm going to speak in the CRC and I'm going to say X, Y, Z. The second he does that, is he someone that would carry enough weight in the CRC? They'll be like, well, I guess we need to think about that. Or the second he would say that, they'd be like, no, you're off the reservation as well. And we're ousting you. So I'm asking you sort of who is the authority that you recognize? Like I'm saying, let's say if Paul's an authority in the CRC, who is the authority you recognize that if he says X, Y, Z, you'd be like, well, I guess this is the new thing we're doing now. Or now we're all agreeing right now that, that Unitarianism is the way to go. What would that look like for you?
Oh man, so not just to recognize Calvin's crimes, but to Servetus, basically, to Unitarian, rather than keep it open between Trinitarianism and Unitarian.
Rather than keep it open, which is like, listen, you're still invited to my party, even if you don't see things the way I do. Okay, that's one version. Great, that would be all, a lot of peace and love. My point is more about, even if you are convinced and you think Sam is right in a certain sense, who is the person that you need to hear? They'd be like, well, I guess if this guy's saying it, that it must be true.
I don't know. I guess I'm I'm low church enough to like whoever makes the best biblical argument, which is kind of the rabbit hole of Sam's channel, because I do always think you're making these super biblical arguments. So, you know, I feel, at least in my conviction, that I would be super comfortable with you being a member at our church, because, you know, I could think of doctrinal positions I've held in my own faith life and my own journey through, you know, understanding my Christian faith more. I'd be like, oh, well, so was I a heretic from, you know, 2013 to 2016, and now I'm good? I've like recaptured my salvation. I don't know. It's like, yeah, maybe that's where I'm too Protestant, where it's like, oh, well, if this figure with some sort of sovereignty says it, then I'm going to go with it. I guess I stick to the Trinitarian position merely because kind of the length of, you know, the historical demand for, in my faith tradition, of like, you have to stay Trinitarian. But I maybe I hold it loosely enough now. The more I come to understand its, you know, its many trapdoors in an attempt to make sense of it. So I don't know if I can answer your question, Kezi.
Yeah, I don't know. I haven't hesitate. One thing that I notice is that, and this is something I'm noticing around Gavin Ortland at the moment too, is that whenever there's a situation where there is sort of political, I don't know, conflict, then it often shuts down theological open-mindedness as one of its first casualties. And almost all the times that I've been, say, pushed out or kicked out of a church have been when that church is or organization is feeling political pressure, either externally or internally. And then that causes people to want to justify their position of authority by showing how orthodox they are on, you know, whatever happens to be their denomination or church's general feelings on orthodoxy, and by being rigid and sticking to their guns and stuff like that. And that's how I can show I'm not going to cave into a political exterior force XYZ. And that I think, hey, Paul, that I think that part of, and I see this happening around Gavin at the moment. You know, Gavin was in the crosshairs of this Megan Basham book. Actually, really, he wasn't. He was only tangentially relevant to the book. And then he became the poster boy of, is she getting her facts wrong, or is she still kind of mostly correct? And it became all about, you know, did she mischaracterize Gavin or not? And this is, you know, related to, you know, the left-wing influence campaigns on Big Eva or whatever. And so Gavin will then feel a great pressure to shore up his bona fides by sticking to orthodoxy, however so defined, to prevent any criticism that he might be a liberal squish or something like that. Hey, Paul.
Are you here to murder the Unitarians?
I am against burning Unitarians. I want to be on record with that. I love Unitarians. I at least know one of them is my friend, I think. So
Paul, let me ask you: had you been in Geneva or at the trial and you stood up and said that to Calvin, what would have happened to you?
How am I supposed to understand the 16th century with that kind of resolution? I mean, Jacob knows. I mean, part of Jacob's story is Jacob knows what it's like to live on the inside of another century, right? Community you live. I mean, to a degree, yeah. I mean, if you're part of a deeply observant religious group, it's a different world. But
Actually, when you said that first, I thought about living in Iran.
Yeah, I thought you meant
yeah,
Tehran.
that too.
Yeah.
Living in Iran is much closer to living in a different century, I think, than living as an Orthodox Jew in the United States or Israel is. And this is part of my disagreement, both with how the Ortho Bros think they understand themselves and how I sometimes think you caricature the Eastern Orthodox. The idea is not that an intelligent Greek Orthodox thinks that what they're doing today is precisely what was done 1,000 years ago. I don't think an intelligent Orthodox Jew or Orthodox Christian believes they're living 1,000 years ago. It's funny. I was at Andrew's Coptic church, right? And I mean, these are the Copts, right? They broke off from the rest of Christianity before Chalcedon, right? And each priest had his own little screen that iPad that he was reading his part of the liturgy off of, and they have this app that they've made for the liturgy, which has all the parts for the different people, so everybody can use their liturgy off the screen, and it's like, how do you square that, right? These people, they're saying words in Coptic, which is
A dead language.
It is a language that is ancient Egyptian and Greek, right? And they're reading it off of iPads.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And, Phlebas made mention here, and he's exactly right. If you grow up CRC, you never read anything from Calvin. You never touch John Calvin. You know almost nothing about John Calvin. The first Calvin I bumped into was when I took the elective at Calvin College on Calvin's Institutes. That was the first Calvin I actually bumped into. Calvinism is a very strange thing in that it's, Richard Mueller with a very straight face could go to Westminster Theological Seminary, break off of the OPC from, in the early beginning of the 20th century and ask, was Calvin a Calvinist? You can find that paper on the internet. It's a fascinating paper. So it's, Calvin is sort of this placeholder. Now, what you're talking about...
Do you know who the first person to read Calvin's Institutes, probably other than Calvin, was Michael Servetus.
That could very well be.
But Calvin sent him an unpublished copy.
Well, Calvin's Institutes in many ways was sort of a printing press version of blogs or vlogs, because Calvin is a French refugee, and he's fleeing persecution. But part of the problem is we like to think that people who flee persecution would never persecute. Never the case. So he flees persecution. He winds up, of course, in Switzerland, is this weird boundary water between France and, there's no such Germany and there's no such Italy. And so he's, in some ways, Calvin is like the TLC, and that he's in Switzerland and he's got training as a lawyer, like one person in this live stream, and he's theologically astute and devout, like probably all of us in this live stream, and he's trying to piece things together. And so what he starts doing is writing these institutes of the Christian religion, where he's sort of trying to process the Reformation. And there's successive There's successive editions of this. So he writes some and it goes out and gets published, and he updates it and he updates it and he updates it. So Calvin's Institute is this nerdy work of trying to process the Reformation, and it becomes this enormous bestseller in Europe, which sort of, propagates Calvinism. But at the same time, so Calvin is like, Calvin's Institutes was the TLC, and Geneva was his estuary. And so, it's this crazy story, John Calvin. And then the Servetus business, Sam, I didn't know that about Servetus, but it makes perfect sense. And it's in many ways just sort of, it sort of fits the entire pattern, because, what to do with Servetus? What to do with Calvin? I mean, you had this enormous disruption of Europe that is happening at this point in time. Again, I can't recommend highly enough Carlos Ayre's Reformations to try and get a handle on what's going on. And my education of the Reformation in many ways was quite poor, because it was mostly a lot of propaganda. But that's what religious communities do. They give their propaganda to indoctrinate their youth. And yes. And you're exactly right, Sam. I mean, if I go to an estuary thing, there are many people in the TLC that are doing really interesting work. They're making these little charts, they're writing these little things, and they can't get anybody to read them. And what would probably be the best thing to happen to the ideas of some TLC nerd was if we reenacted religious persecution and executions. And so maybe we would find someone who was particularly brilliant and brazen. And so we would take a look at all their little charts and things and find everything we found wrong with it and then kill them. So now suddenly their name lives on through history at the cost of their life. It's a weird world, boys and girls.
So Sam,
Servetus sent the Institutes back to Calvin with basically every sentence and page marked up with edits and suggestions, like a week after he got it.
Yep. Super TLC.
Yeah,
TLC.
Servetus was probably 10 out of 10 disagreeable, which helped him and hurt him. But so was Luther. Luther was also 10 out of 10 disagreeable.
Paul, Sam wants to know how you can defend the Athanasian Creed.
I am not going to get into the Athanasian Creed with Sam. It's not going to happen.
Like, why is it so sure that someone who doesn't get the Trinity right goes to hell?
Sam has read far more about the Athanasian Creed than I have. And so I am not in any way prepared right now to debate Sam on the Athanasian Creed. I'm sure and I really want him to talk to Gavin Ortland, because Gavin Ortland has sort of taken up this whole thing. And
although in his response video to me, he doesn't name me, nor does he reference me. And that tells you that
response video.
What?
It was a really weak response video.
The merits aside from the response video, I can tell that Gavin, my predictive model of Gavin's likelihood of talking to me went way down because he wouldn't name me. And I know exactly why. We all know exactly why. He needs to put out a response video so the people who saw my video get a response, but he's not going to name me lest he drive any traffic to me.
Right.
That was exactly the process.
And quite frankly, part of the reason that I reached out to Gavin to talk to him was to basically, lay the groundwork for him to be willing to talk to you.
I appreciate that, Paul. Yeah.
But you have to understand, Jacob, and I think you do understand, that many of us live in confessional communities. And so, we have to be careful about public words. I mean, the Christian Reformed Church, more than in 2020, and Jacob's been celebrating this the whole time, the Christian Reformed Church, more than in 2020, has a higher likelihood of there being heresy trials now, because the Christian Reformed Church is right now, having a degree of purge, getting rid of people who are not ready to affirm a particular understanding of a particular element of the Heidelberg Catechism. So,
and that will make the CRC way less likely to engage in any theological openness on other topics.
True.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the fact that Jacob's had multiple CRC ministers on his channel, history is just weird.
Or Jacob's weird. I don't know.
Lloyd Helmstreet was one of the first people on this screen today.
I know. And and the thing is, when I watch this stuff happen, like I just finished this wonderful conversation between Christian and Aaron. Just lovely, just beautiful. And all right, well, I'm emptying the dishwasher. What else is on YouTube? Anything in the TLC? I see my picture and Sam and Servetus, I assume.
So it's interesting, though, Paul. Michael also, in the last 24 hours, released something about like a precursor to his book that he's finishing up. And he spoke of, like, Michael thinks we're too nice in the TLC. And he says that one of his first experiences was interacting with Jacob, and he didn't realize what this was supposed to be like, and that there's something good about a trial by fire. It's like what is actually.
So he interacted with Jacob and got the impression we were too nice?
No. His impression is that we are too nice now. And he values some of the interactions he's had with Jacob.
Which Michael are we talking about? Sartori.
Sartori.
Well, we have Discord servers where it's not too nice on the Discord servers. So
right, I'm only getting there now. But yeah,
if you want to have a knife fight, go to the Discord server. And you can battle. I mean, one of the things that drove Joey crazy was we start this Discord server and all people want to do is fight about the Trinity. So
right.
Sorry. But
well, it didn't start with you.
So what did you think of Tim Mackey's answer to the question? Because I posed the question straight up to him, and he knew it was coming too.
Yeah.
Regarding fellowship between Trinitarians and non-Trinitarians. And it's all the more awkward because Tim Mackey and I attended the same church together for 3 years.
I think it is not disconnected to, and I think you're exactly right here, Sam. It is not disconnected to, but I also don't understand the relationship between the same-sex marriage conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Because on one hand, I think biologically, it's fairly easy for us to understand that conversations around sexual ethics are super important to multi-generational organic communities. On the other hand, why would the Trinity be that way? But, I loved your conversation with Tim Mackey. That was just beautiful. And so on one hand, I think the CRC needed to make the decision it did. I think it had to. I think if the CRC didn't make the decision it did, it just would have sort of slid off and become just, again, part of the background noise. But at the same time, the CRC has to now walk a line where it continues to need to work on this issue with love. And I think that's the same for Unitarians. And I think part of what you were just saying when I was trying to get this computer configured for this is that when people come after you, it's almost never because of you. And it's probably only tangentially because of the doctrine itself.
Yeah. I mean, it wasn't, we all know who was the person who came after me the hardest. And knowing that person's story is also extremely relevant to thinking about why that was the case.
Right. So this kind of, we do a dance in community all the time. And when we have these huge communities like the Trinitarian community, it's super hard. So, and I, I think, so I always have to, the Daily Wire Android app sucks. It just sucks. It's horrible. And so I always have to find a way to listen to the Daily Wire stuff that I pay for, which sort of annoys me. But Spencer Clavin had a lovely conversation with Jordan Peterson. So they're doing these Foundations of the West things where there's sort of a nicey video that you want to watch on your TV. And then Jordan sort of has a nice dinner with someone. And so he has this lovely dinner with Spencer Clavin. And he starts talking about how masculinity and femininity scale differently. And it's super interesting because, why is there God the Father and not God the Mother? And Peterson had an idea about that, which I can't sort of bring up because it's behind the frickin' paywall. So I might post it on Twitter because, Twitter seems to be pretty loosey-goosey about copyright. But I post a little bit of it on Twitter without getting in too much trouble with the Daily Wire people. But, it's this idea that actually sort of the femininity is sort of housed in the real relationality and the personal, and where masculinity is more housed in the propositional, and it's almost a left brain, right brain thing. So, and the church has to embody both of that. So, and Sam, I have long asked myself, if Sam were to move to Sacramento, what would I do with Sam? Masculinity is more. And would Sam play music at Living Stones? Without a doubt, if I could get him to. Would Sam, the thing is, and again, there's also a difference about talking about things on the internet and talking about things that are unrecorded. And I don't think that's a matter of integrity necessarily. Right. It's a matter of propriety. So this stuff is super hard.
Luke, you came on, I think, for a reason. Do you have something you wanted to add? No, not at all.
I don't know if my internet is good enough to contribute. Am I choppy?
It's fine.
Yes.
Good enough.
Hey, Paul.
Hey, Hezzy, how are you?
Thank God, bless the Lord. I first want to say again, Mazel Tov for your son. What an incredible milestone and moment and experience. So I'm very, very happy for you and the family. I'm sure it was fantastic.
2 sons this summer.
2 sons this summer. Huge. Grandchildren soon to come, please God. So what you mentioned right now about it not being it being recorded, we had a conversation yesterday on the Discord, and I mentioned there to Yoav how on the Discord it's a little different than on a live stream because it's not recorded and the whole internet's not seeing it. And part of my argument was, or let's say steel manning Pastor Paul, was that, and I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but it could be that on live internet, the best I'm going to get right now is, don't burn my Sam. He's invited to my church. And saying more than that, right, is maybe a battle. Either it's not the battle you want, or it's the battle you want, but isn't the army for that, or the people are not ready for that yet. And I guess it's a conversation where it doesn't have to be said. And I do believe this, that with your channel and generally your posture is talking this out, and the whole TLC is creating fertile ground to allow for these thoughts to grow and for people to consider them. I don't have to point and say so now if I said this and I said that, this means that now you no longer agree or you do agree. Rather, it's part of the conversation. And then are we all open to having our minds changed? Are we all open to grow? And I guess this goes back to Sam, which is my point about the no-hides, which is if you're still in Egypt right now, Sam, or you're still in the Exodus, I would say don't be disheartened by that. Realize that you have, I'm going to use this I'm going to flip the term over here, but in this sense, we are a holy mixed multitude. And we are trying to, at the very least, right now, we're with you walking in that desert. And that's a Jew, and that's an Orthodox, and that's a Calvinist, but you're not alone. And I understand that 6 people online is not the family, and 6 people online is not, but who is my kid playing with, and how does his play date look like? But that will happen. And it could be that that's the fight that your son is fighting, and that's scary. I would argue, though, that with the tools that you're giving him, knowing you a little, he's going to have a robust toolkit. And maybe that's what we have to be appreciative of where we are right now. I know that's very hard for you to hear, obviously, but I don't know. I still think we're moving forward ultimately.
Well, okay. So I'm wondering as well about a concept I've dropped a couple of times, which is the yeast working through the lump of dough. So there's an idea that will be introduced, but it takes a long time for it to take everything over. And I think a lot of things that have occurred, people will say, well, we can actually trace this back to the 1700s, and we're only now fully coming to terms with it, right? And I wonder about that within the Protestant churches, where there's like Baptists now saying, we're rejecting the Nicene Creed as necessary because it's not in the Bible, right? And so I don't know. I think that there might be a future where Christology will be far more up for debate among Christian churches that don't, like a church that's very conservative on certain things, won't allow women to become pastors, don't know how they feel about the Trinity. Like that I could actually see that in the future.
Well, the Baptists don't like the Nicene Creed because it says that baptism saves you. Ironically, they disagree about the baptism clause in the Nicene Creed. That is one of the big reasons why the Baptists do not like it, because where is it in there?
Because irony is delicious. That's why I say
we affirm one baptism for the forgiveness of sins right there in the Nicene Creed. That is the line that they actually don't like. And that is really one of the lurking reasons why they don't want to bring it in. And also, if we're affirming a creed, does that mean that the church council are right about all the other things? And how does that connect? There's the ecclesiological question that comes along with affirming a creed from a church council. But it's really, I bet that the point is their theology of baptism doesn't jive well with the Nicene Creed, ironically.
Interesting.
Sam, earlier when I was listening and Hezi was asking about Hezi framed a question. I was still driving. Jacob made me get off at the beginning because I was driving. He wasn't wrong. You framed a question about who or what authority. And I was thinking about how would I answer your question. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought of my other favorite place to hang out that I'm not talking right now, which would be in CRC Voices. I value conversations with people, but it's not conversations with one person or another person that's going to convince me of something so critical to my beliefs. If I have to answer the question, it's probably wrong to answer it the way I was thinking, because my first instinct was to say, really only God would convince me. But people will jump to the conclusion I would probably mean that I was waiting to hear a voice from heaven, and that's not what I'm getting at. But I am saying that I have to take it that seriously, that what I'm reading in the scripture, what I'm hearing in the commentaries, what I'm hearing from the people I interact with, what I'm seeing around me needs to have cohesion. I'm sitting in this other group chat where to say I have questions about the Trinity moves me from the current issue of destruction, the current issue under discussion there, which can limit my action within a church context, to the point where they were debating, when does it become a salvation issue? When do I become a heretic as opposed to just irritating? So I have to answer it from that perspective, because to do anything less really plays right into what the accusation is, which is, if I'm not talking about what I actually think or believe, I'll get accused of lying or cover up or whatever. So the best thing to do is say, I don't know, and what I do know is this.
Right.
And when I say sorry, go ahead, Sam.
No, that's okay. Thank you for saying that. Luke Thompson, I think, is very right when he says that we really only change our minds through relationships of trust. And that he'll say things like, all knowing is personal. Sometimes I still don't think I know what he means by that, but I think at least part of what
he doesn't know what he means by that.
Part of what I think is right about that is that we really change our minds when we are listening to someone we trust, and that they are challenging us or even teaching us. Because it's not like, sometimes we learn new things and it's like, I didn't have an opinion on that subject one way or the other beforehand. I just didn't even know about that subject. And you're teaching me about it. And so I'm trusting you. And so I'm incorporating that into me as true in some sense. And that I think that, why are we always talking about the Trinity? I think it's the Trinity because it's the subject that is defined as the thing that is orthodox, right? Like, if imagine through a different process of Christianity history, we had some other thing, some other doctrine or some other conception that was like, this is the thing that defines us, right? This is the thing that you can't not believe. If it had been some details of how baptism works or something, I think, Jacob's disagreeing with me, but I think that for a lot of people to even hear the Trinity questioned is to hear the thing that defines us is the thing that we're going to have to talk about. And that causes such a topsy-turvy relationship with how do we even talk about the thing if it's the thing that we think is what defines us. It would be
allow me to introduce the subject of discussion among Trinitarians, which is whether or not Jesus is God. And what he said was the first commandment, right? And what, as best we know, he had a copy of, which he wore around on his forehead, and which was on the doors of his home, right? And
he didn't have a home.
Which Christian?
Good point, Michael.
Yeah, great job. Foxes may have holes.
Tend to do a very, very bad job of ever paying attention to, right? Which is Deuteronomy 6:4-9. And you'll find it very interesting, the verses that the Christians completely forget about, which is 6-9. So Deuteronomy 6:4, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord. 6:5, which Christians tend to think is the only thing interesting here. And thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thine heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy might. And the rest of it, which is what we're doing here, which is, and these words which I command thee this day shall be in thine heart, and thou shalt teach them diligently unto thy children, and thou shalt talk of them when thou sittest in thine house, and when thou walkest by the way, and when thou liest down, and when thou risest up, and thou shalt bind them for a sign upon thine hand, and they shall be as frontlets between thine eyes, and thou shalt write them upon the posts of thy house and on the gates. And the fact is, the oneness of God is what is most important. It is always what is most important. And which is why the discussion of the Trinity has to be that which we talk about first and foremost, because it is a negation of that which keeps your soul together. And that was my whole point of this is a salvation issue. It is the Trinity that poisoned the soul of Calvin to the point where he murdered Servetus. And it is the Trinity which poisons the soul of Christians to the point where they are where they are. And I could recite it in the Hebrew, Paul. I know it by heart. ואהבת את השם אלוקיך בכל לבבך ובכל נפשך ובכל מאודיך, והיו הדברים האלה אשר אנוכי מצווך היום על לבביך, ושיננתם לבניך ודיברת בם בשבתך
But can you sing it? Can you sing it?
Even I've been to enough bar mitzvahs where I could have gotten somewhere close at the beginning.
It's my bar mitzvah parsha.
Really, your bar mitzvah parsha is Deuteronomy 6?
Okay. I'm actually wondering, Sam, everyone's going to think I'm just harping on the things I always harp on. Have you ever attended Messianic congregations? Because they sometimes are...
Trinity is a real hot button issue for them.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it goes back and forth because some of them are just evangelical churches with a veneer.
Yeah.
And some of them are like...
there are a lot of... Messianic congregations near me, right? Because I live in an area that's about a quarter to a third Jewish. And so I know of multiple Messianic congregations, and so a lot of evangelical churches near me will have maybe a Hebrew service on Saturdays, which is theologically interesting for all sorts of reasons in and of itself. But as far as I know, it's almost like a more intolerant place to talk about the Trinity because it's such a lightning rod.
Well, it's interesting because at some of them, my personal experience has been that at some of them, they are questioning the doctrines. It may not be distinctly written on their websites, and you might be able to see something where there would be congregations that would be openly welcoming to you.
So
some
Bill
of them,
Schlegel,
not so much.
Bill Schlegel, who Sam introduced me to, when he came on my channel, one of the things he said was that the fact is that Messianic congregations don't talk about the Trinity in order to be more bring
winsome.
More people in, right? Yeah. And then what happens is the fact a bunch of people come in. And then they realize, hold on, now they expect me to be Trinitarian, and it's a huge issue because plenty of people are like, hold up, this Trinity thing is a real burden here, and there's plenty of people, and Rabbi Skobach has said this, many people have said this, there are a lot of people who are pretending to be okay with the Trinity because they have to be. And if the gates were opened and they were allowed to say that they are not Trinitarians, of course they're going to do what a good soul naturally does, which is believe in one God.
Yeah, but this goes back to the TLC again, I think, which is I don't think it's practical for these changes to occur or these conversations even to occur in church, right? Like Sam was just saying right now, it becomes like a lightning rod if these things are mentioned. And it could be that this is why these kind of conversations are necessary because right now, you know, Jacob, you said some pretty intense things about the Trinity, right? And arguably if you were sitting in church, right, people would not be down for that as far as their sermon on Sunday. Right,
I
that's not.
Never walk into a church and explain to them that they're polytheists.
Of course, my point being, for like Michael's not coming to hear Sam necessarily, and Michael, you could correct me if I'm wrong, in church. However, Michael takes Sam with him to church because of this space. And I would argue that Michael's children are going to be a lot more sensitive to a Sam than maybe Michael was growing up or Michael's father was growing up. And I just don't see how. I think these things have to come bottom up, and the only way they come bottom up are people are actually exposed to these conversations, which is why, you know, I love Sam's podcast, because ultimately that is where those conversations are happening. And then you see in the comments, and people are always writing like, "Thank you so much for this. I was not aware of this." They take that back home. So it could be that, again, this is sort of a lonely road that you're walking, but I don't think it's meaningless, and I don't think that it doesn't bear fruit.
Yeah. I mean, there are some fun parts to it. Go ahead, Sandy.
You're super smart, and you can have conversations and podcasts and things where all of these guys will listen to you because of your intelligence and ability and information retention, you know? But aside from that, for me, like, I mean, it's not like I haven't talked to friends about Trinity. It's not like I haven't talked to my sons about Trinity. It's not like people who do not have the resources internally and externally that you possess shouldn't have the conversation. The way I have the conversation happens differently because all I have is myself and evidence of my life and how people think and react to what they see. So how they perceive me is part of their reaction, which is why I think honesty on my part is vital, sort of what I was alluding to earlier. But if we're not having, like, if most people are not having the conversation in church, if you cannot broach the topic of God and say, you know, and then and not include talking about who he is, if the church is so adamant that this is who he is the person of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. And there's all of this dynamics around how you're going to say that. And then you expect to engage with each other. If you can't actually talk about that, what are you even doing in church? Like, that's my take on it. Like, you have to be able to engage. It's like me talking, like having children and never referencing them. I'm sorry. They just exist. We don't talk about it. It's craziness.
I wonder about within Judaism, there will be people at synagogue who are considered much more learned, and that would be kind of acknowledged and have a place. Whereas I don't know if that is the case within Protestantism, that there's like a desire for everyone to be equal. And as a result, like the pastor may know Greek, but because he can't expect everyone to learn Greek, he's not going to teach anyone Greek.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point. And I was like going to bring up something similar. Another whole part of this is just the elite structure within evangelical Christianity is crumbling at the moment, right? That's part of what's going on with Megan Basham's book, both the quality of the institutions and the corruption of the institutions and how much they're listened to or trusted by the, you know, sheep in the pasture is really up for grabs. And the internet is being really hard on that. And Gavin's right there at this weird, I don't know, I feel like there's a spinning of the wheel or something like that, where online personalities and individuals are earning the trust slowly through a respect and relationship they might have with their audience. Although it's like a kind of a one-way relationship with their audience a lot of the time. Paul is unique in that he has a much more two-way relationship with his audience. And that the online world is disturbing the sense-making apparatus of a lot of Protestant churches, which is ironic because the Protestant churches came into existence because the printing press disturbed the sense-making apparatus of the Catholic Church. In a weird sort of way, Catholicism seems to be almost handling this transition better than the Protestants are, which is, sort of a who gets the last laugh. But part of me is like, I feel like I'm like, we're so not even ready to have the Trinity conversation the way it needs to be had, that we need to till the soil first. And I think that that's part of what I'm realizing, and that I'm realizing that my work is tilling a lot of the soil to even get the church in a place ready to be able to talk about our children, like Sandy was saying. Why is it that we can't even talk about this in so many different places now? Although we do have places where we can talk about it, but they seem strangely disconnected and disjointed where the places where we can't, in a way that seems almost schizophrenic or something like that. So I don't know where I'm going, but the institutions and the trustworthiness and having elites and having experts and how expert opinions trickle down to sheep level opinions and all those sorts of things is all being turned upside down right now.
Well, Paul Vanderklay said my whole project here is make authority great again. And to some extent, I think he's right. It ultimately, if we are going to have actual communities, right, we have to get back to distributed cognition where we can trust each other, right? Mm-hmm. And part of the problem I think Protestants have is that the Reformation was about, we don't trust the guy at the front of the congregation anymore, right? We are now going to ad fontes, semper reformando, right? Go back to individual conscience, et cetera, right? And what that has left, and the fact is, ultimately, I don't think 50 years ago, people, even when they said sola scriptura, even in a Baptist church, ultimately, they're reading a translation. And those translations have a very particular theology that is baked into them. And yes, now that we have an internet where anybody can come listen to Jacob actually teach you the Hebrew, right? That's changing the authority structure. But you can't get away from hierarchy. You will ultimately have to settle back into a hierarchy, or everything's going to fall apart. And the question is, how do we have a hierarchy that's not corrupt?
Well, I think, though, about...
Hang on. I was going to bring up what Jacob just said, but from the opposite direction, because I was going to say there's so much of what is happening at the moment where it's everybody's talking equality in the sense of everybody gets an equal take on things and everybody gets an equal opinion, and every opinion is equally valid in a sense, is some of the types of argument that I'm starting to see. And yet the word trust has come up a lot lately. I am hanging out in voice chats with people, and one of the things that we're talking about quite a lot is exactly that dynamic. And I think it has to, I don't disagree with Jacob that we have to get back to it, but I think what I'm seeing is that we're not sure what we're getting back to. So on the bottom, like on the ground level rumblings, it's a matter of how do we engage trust again, because what we're doing right there is, I'll say to people, in some sense, we're practicing, because we're saying we all saw this or we all heard that, or how do we talk about it? We're learning to talk about it. We're learning what we trust, who we trust, why we trust, and we're balancing it against all these tough questions.
Well, so
then there's that.
Yeah.
Sorry.
One of the things I would say is that there's also this issue where people come in a position of authority, and when we go to first, like, I also want the proof to be in the pudding, because I have conversations with people with tons of doctorates who don't understand the basics of the scriptures, right? And so there's a real issue within that, where you're having a conversation with someone and you're like, you are higher up the hierarchy technically than me, but I know that you don't understand this as well. Like, Sam very quickly reveals himself to know church history. He speaks, and it's the way that he says things in passing, which is basically impossible to fake, right? Is that it's the way that the proof is in the pudding. Because I think about in the early 20th century, there was this guy who, or late 18th century, he claimed to be Japanese. He was not Japanese. People would host this guy for dinner parties, and he would teach them about Japanese culture. And he just made whatever he wanted up so that people would pay him to host. He was just some white guy that had dark hair, and people thought he looked a little bit Japanese. And he's like, I'm just going to tell people I am. And if you carry that authority with you and no one is able to question it, then you can get away with all this crap. And that's kind of how it feels, is like you get people, they have a bunch of doctorates, but they don't know church history as well as Sam, right? Or they have whatever degree, but they don't know Hebrew, or they don't, whatever it is, right? And so there is the problem, and because like I'm a Protestant. I believe Protestantism needed to occur because those systems of authority also become corrupt and need a prophetic voice to destroy them. That's necessary.
You're muted, Sam.
Oh, sorry. My question was, could he make good sushi? Because if he could make good sushi, then he still might be a worthwhile dinner guest.
I also wonder if no one even knows, if you could just make it up, and if it's bad, people are like, you could just be like, it's an acquired taste which you'll never acquire.
Well, that's like that sort of thing is like, okay, imagine one of those people who had hosted him and like, oh man, I learned so much about Japanese culture. And then they later meet a Japanese person or lots of Japanese people, or go to Japan and they're like, oh shoot, I was had, once they see the full real thing. That's a little bit what I feel like part of the purpose of my channel is like, you can watch some of these YouTube channels, like say Inspiring Philosophy or something like that, just to name some, that have way more subscribers than I do, that claim to talk about church history and are doing the equivalent of pretending that they're Japanese. And then you listen to my channel, it's like, oh, that was a level of rigor and depth that I didn't get the first time. And now I go back and I look at them like that was pretend Japanese. But yet, why is it that they get more clicks than I do? Because they're playing into whatever. Go ahead, Hezzy.
So the Black Hebrew Israelites have this thing where they discovered that the vowels in Hebrew were invented about 1,000 years ago by rabbis, and they decided, oh, this is bullshit, right? And they came up with what they call Lashawan Kadash, which is
everything.
Yeah, instead of the vowels that the rabbis came up with, they just do right? So Lashon HaKodesh became Lashawan Kadash, and they created this whole language where they could speak Hebrew without the vowels. And a bunch of them moved to Israel. And their children grew up listening to Lashawan Kadash and listening to people who were speaking actual Hebrew. And now they're like, yeah, our parents were crazy, right? And
they weren't really Japanese, yeah.
And I have to say, the more I learn about Christianity, the more I believe that Pauline Christianity is Paul attempting to tell people he was the Pharisee of Pharisees, when it's kind of obvious to somebody who's an actual Pharisee that he was just pretending to be Japanese.
But so, Jacob and the whole panel, obviously, this goes back to the trust question and back to our authority, which is, it's not enough, Sam, that you're saying these things. And even if someone is convinced, like, wow, I never knew that, I always thought, what does he do with that information? Does he go to his pastor and be like, but look, Sam said so. Who the hell's Sam? Mm-hmm. Right? And he's going to like, but were you aware of this church father? What is the pastor supposed to say to that? Oh, no, I don't really know. So
yeah. And even someone listening to my video once won't be able to repeat it at the quality that I could. They will just have this new sense that, oh, what I thought was really Japanese isn't Japanese, and this is really Japanese. I now have maybe a better discerning taste to recognize the difference, but that doesn't mean I'm suddenly Japanese myself or that I can cook sushi. I now know the difference between pretend sushi and real sushi or something like that. And yeah, so what is someone who listens to my channel supposed to do? Good question. And I do get emails like that from time to time. And my answer is mostly like, I'm sorry, bud, good luck. I wish I had something more for you. Here's a website that lists Unitarian churches. I hope that you live in a handful of special locations where you've got one. If you don't, I'm happy to answer any questions you might have, and feel free to email me again, but I don't have a lot for you, and I'm sorry. I'm in that position a lot, and that's part of why my tact of strategy is not so much make as many Unitarians as I can as quickly as I can, because then I'm inviting people into this kind of path of misery, but to try and till the soil such that I don't need to be inviting people on a path of misery if they suddenly start thinking I'm right.
So doesn't it go back, though, to what Jacob threw on screen a while back out of Deuteronomy 6? Because you look at the things, and if you say you are Trinitarian, but you say that you hold to those verses, if you say you are not Trinitarian, but you're Unitarian, and you say that you hold to the truth from those verses, if you say you're Noahide, and you don't think, like if you say that you follow the one true God, doesn't it come back to get to the nuts and bolts of what is being asked of us for whoever we are, in the context where we do not blow up that truth?
Yeah. And that's generally my advice, is to the extent that you like, if imagine someone's at an evangelical church, has listened to enough of me and decides that I'm right. My general advice is stay there, keep going there. Don't sign anything that you disagree with, but otherwise try not to cause problems. Abide there while you can, and you might have to be a Nicodemite, which is the Christian phrase for someone like Nicodemus who goes to Jesus and agrees with Jesus, but keeps being on the Jewish ruling council, and sort of be someone who's a little bit secretive about your beliefs, but do so in a way that maintains as much integrity as you can. And I think that there are people who do that in their churches all the time on various questions that might be the Trinity or might be something else. Like, there are tons of people who probably don't agree with their pastor on all sorts of things, if they were to be completely honest. And I just think that we're in a situation where we think what holds us together is not what's actually holding us together. And we're in a weird state of dishonesty about that at the moment. But hopefully that might change.
Sam, do you think that that's related to
This goes back to
sacramentality?
something that Yosef and Jacob and I talk about often.
Go ahead, Hezi.
With no heights. Well, what I think Hazi was saying is what I was thinking of saying, which is no heights. I mean, there are. Yeah, we lost you for a bit, Hazi.
I was going to say that this is where I think our Christian brothers need to adopt an argument for heaven's sake, because in the synagogue, plenty of people don't disagree with the rabbi, but that's not a bug, that's a feature. Because to a certain extent, because the attitude is, wrestling with God, obviously. And I would argue, not in these words, but when Paul says, don't touch my Sam, and I want him playing in my church, is that him saying an argument for heaven's sake, right? He's saying, I would be happy if Sam would agree with me. However, me not condemning him to hell, or me not agreeing with that at least, is me saying that, I don't know for sure. And that's why, as long as he's being honest, and I know his heart's in the right place, then I know he's still part of the tribe. And I would argue that, yeah, sorry.
Yeah, so I'm very much agreeing. This is connected, though. I wonder what role sacramentality has with this, because the idea of excommunication, part of the notion was that if I'm giving you communion, and I believe you're in an improper state, I am having you eat and drink judgment upon yourself. So it was actually seen also as a form of mercy to excommunicate you, to not allow you to participate in communion.
Right. That's what the word excommunication quite literally means.
Yes. Yeah. You're not participating in this. And that was actually seen as so that you don't so that you are not eating and drinking a wrath or judgment upon yourself. So this idea where even within churches where there's an open table policy where we're not going to make sure that they're people of good standing. If an absolute douchebag wants to get up and have communion and he wants to eat and drink judgment upon himself,
that's
go
on
ahead,
him.
buddy.
That's on him. Yeah.
It's on him. It's not on us, right? So the idea of, and within Judaism, there's also like a notion of, well, in some Christian groups too, sharing the table. Like, who are we willing to break bread with and who are we unwilling to break bread with? So that's where I think the lines start getting drawn.
I disagree with open table, but I also only go to churches with open tables.
But oh, that's funny. But
that's a lot of fun. Tell me, Sam.
Well, you can reverse engineer the reason why. Anyway, go ahead, Jacob.
Sam, didn't you say you went to an open table church and they still asked you not to take communion?
Correct. I mean, not every church, believe it or not, is fully logically consistent with their own stated policies and beliefs, and will occasionally verge into hypocrisy or self-contradiction. Imagine that.
Sartori, you were being quiet. Stop being quiet.
Sorry,
He's been quiet the entire time. We've heard nothing from him.
Well, I'm here. I'm here because my wife heard a raccoon, and then she called an exterminist. So I had to come home and clean out the garage. Now he's on the roof. So
the exterminator
or the raccoon. Yeah,
exterminator.
That's exactly.
Yeah.
You mentioned God's providence earlier in this stream. Somebody mentioned something about timing and God's providence.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. Well, you know, it's funny. It's funny just because with this whole thing, my new perspective, and I should probably talk with Sandy more about this because she knows more about stuff. But, you know, finding out I'm like an Asperger person or whatever, you know, having some amount of the
I like saying autist, like artist, but
yeah, right.
Autist.
But like, and hearing the testimony of like, or, you know, the stories of so many people and like why they've left churches. And it's like, really, if you have something, which could be the Trinity, or a lot of times it's like creation, and you just get the because we say so answer, then they're just going to leave. But like, you know, what, like the propositional layer works to a certain extent for a certain thing, but there's a difference in the quality of people. And so like, you know, how I can, you have to judge things by the people who trust. And so in that sense, like I trust Jacob, I trust Sam, because I can tell that even though their beliefs are different from mine, they come out of the same desire to be true, to seek the truth, and seeking the truth for a good reason, you know, like, and I would assume because Sam was raised in his tradition and he's convinced of it, that means that his parents did a good job of teaching him. And when it comes to faith, that means that they had to live it consistently, because a parent that teaches you the propositions correctly, but is a hypocrite and a jerk, that they're not going to reproduce their faith. So, you know, and in that sense, it's like the Mormons, they have all sorts of wacky beliefs, but they've made such a culture of,
but they're so nice.
Family. Well, but the fact that they're so family orientated means that they can pass their faith on strongly, because they're building the trust with their children. And so why would their children walk away from that if their parents are living it well?
I think you hit on a great point, Michael. I think underappreciated reason why Sam is still Unitarian is because I have a great relationship with my dad.
So let me give a plug for the 2 times Sam's dad came on my channel. Some of the best discussions I've ever had. And I recently had Tracing Wood Grains on my channel, and he is an ex-Mormon who still likes the Mormons, and that was one of the best discussions I've ever had. But yeah, I think we're reorienting in new trust networks, and that's great.
Yeah. And therefore, I can just make everyone out there in the world jealous. At the Chicago conference, we had a special dinner where Vanderclay was sitting next to my dad and Jacob and myself, and we talked about speaking in tongues, and it was wonderful. And the whole world can wonder about what that conversation about speaking in tongues over Italian food was like.
I still have not convinced you to stay away from that demonic practice.
It's because I respect my father too much, perhaps. All right, I should probably like do work and stuff, but anyway, this was good. Jacob, thanks. Bat signal received. It doesn't work every time, but it works sometimes.
You really should make that short answer to Ortland.
I will make an answer to Ortland. I think I will make 2 videos. One will be kind of more at a high level thing, which is sort of like
1 minute. Make a 1 minute. Bam, bam, bam. You have to do that. You have to do that.
Maybe.
Sam, can I ask you before you go though? Why are you okay with Trinitarians?
I am partially okay with Trinitarians because I think most of them don't mean it. And that to be perfectly blunt, is that most of the time I think like when I'm in a Bible study with people who don't know that I'm a Unitarian and they're Trinitarians, I'm just like praying to God the Father in the name of Jesus Christ, thanking God for his son Jesus who died on the cross for our sins, and thank you for filling us with your spirit, God, et cetera, et cetera. I'm just like blasting my Unitarian theology as makes sense to me. And they're like, amen, brother, right? You know, like that is at the level where I think that the disagreement is superficial and not at the deep level of what they really act as if they believe. Except for maybe some special cases of people who have really studied themselves into deeply believing in the Trinity in a way that's problematic. Like maybe Calvin, like John Calvin could be an example of that. Whereas most Christians are like, there's God's son, and or his spirit gets in us. I have no idea what that really means or how that works, but I guess I agree with it. And, you know, like that is, I think mainly the reason why I am not bothered is that I think that deep underneath there is a non-Trinitarian Christianity that is alive and well in most Christians that is not really the Trinitarian thing that people think it is.
But do you agree that if they do become convinced of the Trinity, if they do look into it, that they will?
It's harmful to go. It's hard. The further in that direction you go, it's harmful for your soul. Yes.
Yeah. And like, that's the thing. Trinitarianism poisons the soul.
Hello? But it is a mile wide but an inch deep for most Christians. Hey, Kale. Hey, exciting preview. Kale is coming to the Chicagoland area next week. And I will be doing a live in-person recording, hopefully right here. Hopefully this microphone and all of the equipment works for this. I will be doing a live conversation with Kale and Moises from the beloved basement of Transfigured. And I am super excited to meet Kale face-to-face. So preview of coming attractions, hopefully out sometime next week. Maybe we'll do it live, maybe not. I'm not sure if I trust my equipment enough for that. We'll see.
Sam, do you really have to go, or can I bug you about a couple of things?
You can bug me a couple things.
Okay. Just questions about, because some Unitarians still believe in a pre-existent Christ.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
What are your thoughts on that? Do you think
I'm non-pre-existence in any
I know,
literal,
but do you think that their references are good references? What do you think?
Oh, I see their points. There are some passages that they have an easier time with, some passages they have a harder time with. And you can certainly make the historical argument, at least into the early 2nd century, of that having been a common Christian belief of some sort of pre-existent subordinationist Unitarianism, like Justin Martyr or whoever. So I respect them, and but yeah, I don't agree with them.
Can I ask a point A or B on that? Does it tie in with the whole concept of pre-existence in general, like the Jews do it, like Adam Kadmon, and or our souls choosing our whatever prior to, like, how does that fit?
I mean, that's a whole nother very good and interesting question, Sandy, is that I think sometimes the pre-existence you see in early Christianity is the belief in the pre-existence of everybody. And then some people are like, oh, Jesus pre-existed. Look, they believe in the pre-existence of Christ. It's like, well, they believe in the pre-existence of everybody, you dope. You know, like, it's like, oh, Origen thought that Jesus's soul, descended down into the human body at the appropriate time. He thinks that happened for you too, right? It's just he thinks Jesus had a particularly good soul, a soul of a higher caliber and fidelity to God than yours.
I'm thinking specifically of like logos.
Yeah.
Of like, would you identify Christ as? I've heard some of your name theology of like he gains the name of Hashem, but would you say like the word the same thing? Or
Servetus has such a complicated and intricate, and I find persuasive, view on these sorts of questions. That, and again, he's really leaning on Philo and traditions similar to him, that there was this sort of heavenly form of Christ, which is, I think, like I forget the Adam whatchamajigger, I'm forgetting the Hebrew word.
Kadmon.
Adam Kadmon.
Right, sort of like the heavenly man, who in a certain sense is the form of a perfect man, but it's like he pre-exists, but it's not quite in the full personal sense, kind of, right? It's sort of like a model or abstraction, or something along those lines. Maybe you could disagree with me on that. And that Servetus is like, when the Holy Spirit came on the Virgin Mary, it was like a breath of Adam Kadmon into Mary, and that this sort of heavenly form of man that was pre-existent but not quite personal in the sense that a human being down here in time and space was like breathed into Mary, and that's how Jesus is the Word made flesh, is something like that.
Yeah, this is actually something Jews often get wrong. Adam Kadmon was never a physical being.
Right. And I don't think that Servetus would say that. He calls it the Christ. He says, like, when he's talking about Adam Kadmon or the form of man, he calls it the Christ, and that the Christ was sort of blown into Mary, spiritual conception, and that turned it into a flesh and blood human being. So does Michael Servetus believe in the preexistence of Jesus or not? He would say that it would be inappropriate to call the form, the Christ, the Son of God. It's not a son until it's born in Mary. That's the begottenness. That's when it's a son. Jesus,
let me cut you off.
God,
would you agree with this for yourself, though?
Oh, I'm still thinking about this, and like some of his theology I agree and some I don't. But like the way that I was always taught growing up is that Jesus exists in the foreknowledge of God, right, and that he is predestined to exist, and that kind of cosmic history is designed around him as the linchpin,
right, but
that he doesn't exist in reality until Mary. And I think that's sort of like a vague way, like of it's very similar to Servetus's idea in a certain sense. Although Servetus will also say that when people have like a vision of God on the throne, right, like Isaiah or Ezekiel or whoever, that they're not seeing God himself, because one cannot. They're seeing the Christ, and that this is like some sort of the Christ is serving as both a revelation and a veil at the same time, right? You're seeing something into heaven that's not normally visible, but it's still sort of protecting and revealing at the same time you from seeing God in his essence.
Right.
and
it
his
lets you
fullness.
see, but in order that you're seeing it, it is therefore can't be the full thing itself.
Right. So you're seeing God in a more real sense than you normally do in ordinary vision, but you're still not getting the full blast of revelation because that would destroy you or blind you or something like that. And
What
so
about-
they're seeing, in a certain sense, they're seeing Jesus,
Right,
really,
right.
according to Servetus. But it is not this personal animated thing. It's this thing that will later become and be fully revealed as a man, as Jesus in the virgin birth. And,
Well,
and
How is that? Sorry, go ahead.
Servetus apparently had a copy of the Mikra Gedolot, the Rabbinic Bible, which definitely had Nachmanides in it, probably had Al-Radak, and so he appears to be very ingrained in what is sometimes referred to as like Spanish Jewish Kabbalistic thought of the 1300s.
he certainly knew the Kabbalah. He often is critical of Kabbalah, but he does love Maimonides. Whenever he's quoting Maimonides, it's favorably. He quotes the Talmud.
Which works of Maimonides?
A guide to the perplexed for sure, but I don't remember off the top of my head. There might be more too. And then he quotes a bunch of other rabbis as well. And he, like, what I think is fundamentally unique about Servetus that makes him different from the other reformers is that Christianity, starting in like the 2nd or 3rd century, really became distrustful of Jewish sources. And that there was an anti-Jewish, if like it would become a slur in church history if your theology was called Jewish. And sort of this really anti-Jewish bias. And that became very established, in the early centuries. That doesn't seem to be the case. Like when you're reading Clement of Rome, he quotes, he seems to have favorable impressions of the Jews, but relatively quickly on, you see that sort of settle in. And a lot of the reformers, like especially Luther, carry on, if not even heighten, that anti-Jewish sentiment. And I think Calvin was pretty similar. But Servetus is one of those people who might be among the first of his kind to be like, well, wait a minute, guys, this Christianity thing arose from Judaism. And if we're going to fix this thing and set it right, and we're going to restore it to its original, which is what we seem to be trying to do here, fellow reformers, then we're going to have to switch from a negative valence on Jewish sources to a positive valence on Jewish sources. And so we should learn Hebrew, and we should read Philo of Alexandria. And I think the reason why he likes Philo so much is that he's right at or right before Jesus's time. So he's trying to get into that Jewish cultural mindset, at least with the sources available to him. And he views Philo as sort of a faithful and historically relevant example of a Jewish mindset at the time of Jesus that can help us restore Christianity to a proper Jewish faithful setting. And so he flips from having a negative Jewish valence to a positive Jewish valence. And he's one of the first examples of that, I think, in Christian history.
But Philo believed that God was tri-personal.
Kind of. I mean, I think that Philo's proto-Trinitarianism is overblown. I think that Philo, he will call the Logos a second God. And that's honestly...
And separates the spirit from those two.
Yeah, but he also does that with other things too. And it's not just Son and it's not just Logos and Spirit. Philo's right there at the border, I think, of having sort of personified attributes versus like these things that are actually distinct and have their own sort of personality. But there are also things where Philo is just very Unitarian monotheistic as well.
Right.
And so I think he's sort of at that border. And I think some Christians, turn the Logos into a full-blown person kind of after Philo. And that Michael Servetus is sort of like backtracking and going down the let's just have attributes and still have a monotheistic Unitarian God.
How is the Lamb of God sacrificed before the foundations of the world?
Actually, for the record, that verse in Revelation is probably grammatically mistranslated.
Okay.
And
grammatically translate it proper, please.
All right. So, 1 second. All right.
I'm sorry to be bothering you.
No, it's okay.
I'm not always on the stream at the same time as you, and it's oftentimes not to address exactly these issues.
All right. So what verse is this in Revelation? This is Revelation 13:8. All right. So, and all that dwell upon the earth shall worship him, whose names are not written in the book of life of the Lamb, slain before the foundation of the world. So the question is, does from foundation of the world refer to the Lamb being slain, or does it refer to when names are written in the book of life? It's grammatically ambiguous. And there are multiple other places in the book of Revelation itself where it talks about names being written in the book of life before the foundation of the world. So I actually think that probably the better grammatical choice is to say that before the foundation of the world refers to when names get written in the book of life. And he's not saying that the Lamb was slain before the foundation of the world. He's saying that the book of life is of the Lamb who was slain. Right. And that was written before the foundation of the world. Not saying that the Lamb was slain before the foundation.
I've wondered how it might be tied with rabbinic thought that in order for an infinite God to interact with the world, there must be, God creates a division within himself so that there is an aspect of himself, the contracting, in order for God to be able to interact with the world itself. Right? Mm-hmm. Is like there needs to be a laying down of infinitude to interact with the finite.
Right. And well, what's funny is, so, you know, Phlebas is pushing on me. What's funny is that actually a lot of Unitarians like that before the foundation of the world verse and applying it to the Lamb being slain, because that sort of in their minds supports the idea of an abstract plan written beforehand that then comes to fruition. Because it's like, well, no one really thinks Jesus was actually crucified before the world was made. This is talking about what's happening in God's foreknowledge, and it's an example of the foreknowledge real existence distinction. And so a lot of Unitarians use that verse to make that very point. But, you know, Phlebas says he's got a perfect translation for everything. I mean, the Amplified translation is like a very commonly used literal translation. All the inhabitants of the earth will fall down and worship him. Everyone whose name has not been written since the foundation of the world in the book of the life of the Lamb who has been slain. Right? So this is not a controversial thing to say in, you know, scholarly circles, that the before the foundation of the world probably applies to the book of life being written, not the Lamb being slain. So anyway, I'll just happen to note, why is it that every favorite Trinitarian passage happens to be a controversial one that has a plausible alternative reading? That is my contrapoint over there, Phlebas. Why is it that always the Trinitarians lean on a very disputable passage to try and make their points?
Right.
And it's never a teaching of Jesus.
Well, and can I say thanks, Sam, because when I first tagged on to like David's first question, I am not well read, as I said, in the spaces that you are. I've never read anything about Philo. I've never read anything about Servetus. I've read in the Bible, English at that. But the question that I raised is because I've thought a lot about this thing, and this is one of the reasons that I am not settled on all of the Trinity stuff. I'm kind of like, there are things where I guess I've just kind of gone, you think weird things. And then you're telling me that people in the 1300s were talking about this. And I've been sitting and listening to Jacob's Jewish stream going, people have been writing about stuff. I think there's a truth out there, but I'm not sure. Well, I'm pretty sure that Christianity has messed up a lot of people because of what you just said. It all hinges on controversy.
Well, I wonder,
I'm not sure that like it has to. Like, I don't have a good answer for my life, except I got in an argument with God. The words, "This is my plan," came up, and I didn't feel compelled to have to, include the Trinity in that. Just go to where I was told to go, just do, and just be a good mom.
I have a question between Jacob and Sam. Is Jacob, do you think that Paul is Trinitarian? And same question. So, Sam, you accept the letters of Paul, correct?
Yeah.
You're totally fine with that.
Totally fine.
You don't think that it does something anti?
No, so I mean, sometimes
anti-Unitarian.
when people say, there's some good evidence that 2 Timothy might not be authentically Pauline, and there's sometimes where some of those arguments are persuasive. But I'm totally willing, honestly, most of the time, to accept the full Pauline corpus as authentically Pauline.
Okay, so Jacob, do you believe that the Pauline canon is anti-Unitarian?
I think you can definitely make an argument that Paul was binitarian. I think that the Gospels are actually more binitarian than the writings of Paul are, especially John.
What do you mean by binitarian exactly, Jacob?
I mean actually believing in this two gods.
Two powers in heaven, the little Hashem that's in some Jewish writing.
There is a representative of God that has to interact with the world because God cannot interact directly, right?
And that's a priestly role. That's a priestly role.
So this idea, which isn't as foreign to Judaism as the full-blown Trinity. Certainly, the egalitarian Trinity, I would say, is an obvious monstrosity that could not have existed even in the first 1,000 years of Christianity, because at the time Christianity was too Jewish, right? What ended up happening with the egalitarian Trinity, and where Jesus becomes truly God, the way that like a Protestant will just pray straight to Jesus. Like if I say pray to God, they'll say Jesus, right? And it's like, okay, that is not the understanding I think that even the Gospel of John has, right?
Okay.
And this is partially why, and I wouldn't say this anymore, but for a while I was saying that the monarchical Trinity sounded more monotheistic to me than the way Sam was seeing Jesus, because the monarchical Trinity has this idea: okay, there's true God, right, and God, Jesus's God, is ineffable, and then you end up with a revelation of godliness in its fullness, which is Jesus, right? Which is a lot more, I would say, similar to Jewish theology than this idea. No, Jesus is God, right? Like the way I've seen it on too many bumper stickers here in Los Angeles. Jesus is God, read the Bible, right? It's an actual bumper sticker people get, right? And it's like, that type of understanding of God is even more polytheistic. And I mean, halakhically, from a Jewish standpoint, right, we talk about shittuf, right? This idea of, okay, you realize that there is a God who is the creator of the universe, who is ineffable and beyond, like, being, like, living, dying, going to the bathroom, eating, drinking, all of the things that Jesus obviously did, right? Yet you view Jesus as a revelation of God. That is, as far as I understand Judaism, far, far more understandable as a still mistake, right? Because anybody, and I would say the Bible is very clear about this. Anybody who mistakes an angel for God himself, the Bible is very clear about how that is a mistake, right? A representative of God is not God. Yet that is a...
But you need to treat the representation in a certain sense with the respect given to God, and understand that there is a certain sense in which the representation is God, while not confusing the fact that it's a representative.
So how do you get to that point? Because when I'm listening to sort of Jacob explain some of the views that Christians have, and the the route I just watched happen in front of me was, first God decides he's going to make man in his image. So he does. And then God decides he's going to make Jesus, which is man in his image, that is really God in the image of man in God's image. And I'm like, what? Because that's what we're saying in some ways.
I might agree with Jacob that Paul is at least somewhat binitarian in the way that Jacob was defining it. But I still think that he thinks that the person of Jesus Christ entered heaven newly to a place where he hadn't been before in a personal sense after his ascension into heaven. And that this has caused a change in the cosmos at the highest and most fundamental level, and now changes how all people must relate to God now through Jesus. And so I'm sort of like a two powers in heaven at post ascension, right? Kind of thing. Right.
Well, it is very interesting, Sam, because if you get into like Rabbi Akiva's perspective on the Son of Man, some people, even within the Talmud, there's discussion where it says, Akiva, this sounds a little like, because there's an idea that a human being could be seen in heaven sitting on a chair. When he's talking about that, people are like, if you're in heaven sitting on a chair, that's to be sitting in a position of authority, as in to be, how does Akiva put it? Like sitting as a judge.
I really think Christians way overinterpret that discussion. And this was one of the first things I talked to Father Stephen about when he came on my channel, is like, look, if there's a discussion in the Talmud, it's a discussion, right? Like,
yeah. No. I'm trying to. I'm not saying this is the Jewish perspective. Right. What I'm saying is, and there's discussion as to who this character could be. It could be that Elijah, when he's taken up, is given an angelic form, and then he becomes the Son of Man figure. It could be someone like Enoch, and that there's reason to believe that the book of Enoch has part of this perspective, where you would see a human being sitting on a throne, and to what extent is this binitarianism, or to what extent could a human being be caught up into a role that is like an angel or like Hashem in heaven? Like that, these are real serious conversations.
And I would ask about the word sit in general, because of all of the Psalms I've spent time in the last 2 years. The first Psalm has had a lot of my attention, and trying to suss out the three parts of at the beginning of the first Psalm. It says, blessed is the man who walks not after the way of the wicked. No.
Yeah, or sits in the seat of the scoffers. So the idea...
There's a middle one. So he doesn't walk in the way of the wicked. He doesn't stand in the way of the sinners. And he does not sit in the seat of scorners. So I'm kind of like, what's the purpose of not of that, and warning us that, and saying, but the righteous man, he meditates in the law of God night and day. So those are very different activities, and I figure they're there for a reason.
Yeah.
So when you start in the word sit, that psalm comes
Yeah.
to mind, and I'm like,
Sitting is considered a position of authority.
So I think like this passage, I'll read a passage that I think is very indicative, like very telling of Paul's theology and Christology. And also this is from 2 Corinthians, which even Bart Ehrman and like super skeptical scholars would think is genuinely Paul. In their case, the God of this, he's talking about people who don't believe in Jesus. In their case, the God of this world has blinded the minds of the unbelievers, right? And the God of this world is Satan. You know, he calls Satan.
That's why Jacob is wearing glasses, to be clear.
Right.
Continue.
Although it's a little bit tongue in cheek, but anyway, in their case, the God of this world has blinded the minds of the unbelievers to keep them from seeing the light of the gospel of the glory of Jesus Christ, who is the image of God, right? Capital T, image of God. For what we proclaim is not ourselves, but Jesus Christ as Lord, with ourselves as your servants, your being the Corinthian church, for Jesus' sake. For God, who said, let the light shine out of darkness, has shone in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. And this is right after he's talked about the passage where Moses comes down from the mountain and his face is shining and he has to put a veil over his face because he's just been in the presence of God. So he's using that idea to be like, the glory of God is shining through the Lord, Jesus as Lord. And again, like you've seen my name video where I think Jesus or God sort of gives the title the Lord to Jesus as his new sort of hyper appointed, subordinate second God-ish, name position.
Which is not just master, it's Hashem. Like
right. Right. It is the word that normally in Greek veils Hashem. Yeah.
It's that name that's right under you.
Yes. And then like God's glory, you don't see God's glory. You're not looking at God himself, right? It's the same thing. That same kind of like, when you see God in a vision, who are you seeing? What are you seeing? You're seeing the glory of God, the light of God that's coming through the face of Jesus. And I think that is really like Paul, the high, like that's the high point and clearest thing that you can see in Paul's Christology.
How would you feel about the term emanation, that like as light emanates?
Like Jesus is a mirror reflecting the light of God or something like that. There's also verses that say exactly that. And the idea of a super clean mirror, in some ways we all reflect God's light, but a mirror that's perfectly polished and clean will reflect it better than a mirror that's muddy or dirty or broken. And so that Jesus is like the perfectly clean mirror where the light comes through God, or the light of God comes through Jesus in a clearer, more perfect way than anyone else, something like that.
Or is it the kind of mirror that Haris was talking about in, I forget where, but anyways, he was pointing to, and I shared a video of where he was talking about normal mirrors versus real mirrors, where the most mirrors will reflect us so that we're opposite to how we are. So we see ourselves a little bit backwards, whereas there's a kind of mirror where you look, and that showed this guy going around getting people to look in this type of mirror, and you see yourself just as if somebody else is looking at you, not backwards.
Unflipped, yeah.
Yeah. Because I'm kind of like...
Because when you're looking at a mirror, are you looking at a mirror or are you looking at yourself? Right?
A mirror.
Well, in a certain sense, both, right? What do you see? Do you see yourself or do you see a mirror? Right? And the answer is kind of both in one way and one way another. Like when you're talking on your phone and you say, "Good night, honey, I love you," are you telling your phone that your phone is your honey and that you wish and that you love your phone? Are you telling your wife that you love your wife and that she's your honey and that you want her to have a good night, right? It's sort of that's just the role of an intermediary or a means by which something is manifested or emanated. Anyway, it's now after 1 o'clock my time. I should get going. All right. See you later, Jacob. And everyone else. Sorry, I didn't mean that.
Bye.
All right. Bye.
Well,
okay, Michael, what do you want to say?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, I guess, I just am of the opinion of, to the extent that God is so unknowable in some ways, it seems strange that his character is particularly obsessed with us having correct understanding of his unknowable nature. Like as I see it, like the grace to the bad beliefs, which as a Trinitarian, I would say I am in the position of wanting to extend it further than most, where I can see, hey, some of these Jehovah's Witnesses really mean it. Some of these Mormons really mean it. And I think, and that doesn't mean necessarily that because there aren't, other theological positions downstream of, the nature of God himself, that they aren't in error. Like I think that I worked at a church for a long time that made people feel like the grace was often out of reach more than it should be, or that so and I think some churches make people feel like sin is not something worth struggling against too, and that's also a problem. But I think God is very patient with our finite brains trying to wrestle with this stuff. So
I agree, and this is part of the thing with I mean, I kind of push Sam to say that yes, Trinitarianism is poison for the soul, which he is very reluctant to say. I don't think exactly for the same reasons that Sam says. I don't think most Christians are damned or anything like that. Mostly because I don't think most Christians believe in anything like a Trinity. I mean, they don't discuss it, they don't live it, they don't know much about it, which is great. At the same time, I think when you place, I mean, the way I put it is when you start with 1 equals 3, you're going to end up with 2 plus 2 equals 5. I do think that it is fundamentally something that, especially when it's put at the forefront, and I do think it becomes a problem. And that's why I think Christianity ultimately does have to recognize, and that's, I mean, to bookend this whole thing, that's how I started the stream, is you have to ask yourself, why was John Calvin not able to live the gospel? Why was he not able to live what we would expect of a Christian in his life? And I think that the Trinity is a huge part of that. And again, it goes back to, okay, why is Judaism so incredibly, why is the Old Testament, and this is the funny thing, like Christians will say to me that Judaism has become so monotheistic in response to Christianity. And it's like, have you read the Old Testament? Why do you think it is so absolutely and clearly harping on this? Why do you think God needed to make this the focal point? Because it is that important. And with that, I think I'm going to end the stream because I got to go do stuff.
all right.